Two completely different texts, set during completely different time periods. Shakespeare's Twelfth Night was written between 1601 and 1602 and is a generally joyous romp about, amongst other things, love disguise, what it means to be a man or a woman, and also a fool or foolish. Two twins, Sebastian and Viola, are shipwrecked and are saved separately, leaving each one to assume the other's death. Viola worries about her own safety as a woman and in a foreign land, and so decides to disguise herself as a man. She quickly finds favour with Duke Orsino, who uses her to carry messages of love to the Countess Olivia. Olivia isn't remotely interested in Orsino, but does quickly fall for the youthful-looking, sharp-tongued messenger Viola, who is calling herself Cesario. Viola, meanwhile, falls head over heels in love with her master Orsino, who, like Olivia, thinks she is a young man. Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, by contrast, was written in 1937 and set in America during the Great Depression. It stars George and Lenny, two wandering labourers who are forced to move from ranch to ranch in search of employment. George is a small canny worker who looks after Lenny, an enormous beast of a man, but without the understanding to always appreciate the effects of his own strength. The ending to Of Mice and Men sees George tragically forced to shoot his friend Lenny after he accidentally breaks the neck of a married woman. Two vastly contrasting plot lines and settings, but both texts share one thing in common: the isolation and loneliness of key characters. Occasionally, the isolation is self-imposed. With other characters, it is due to racial prejudice, whilst one should not discount the effects of historical context in making men far more wary of forming meaningful relationships. So stay tuned. Let's explore the theme of isolation and loneliness within Twelfth Night and Of Mice and Men. You're watching Schofield on Shakespeare. At this point, I'd like to make the distinction between what is isolation and what is loneliness. I see isolation as the state of being alone, often for long periods of time. Loneliness is similar to this, but with the addition of feeling unhappy about your isolation. This distinction is important when it comes to exploring our first character, Malvolio from Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. Malvolio is the Countess Olivia's steward, and with a great sense of his own self-importance. He is very quick to judge others, and on his very first appearance on stage has some harsh words to dish out about and towards Olivia's fool, Feste. He declares pompously, "I marvel your ladyship takes delight in such a barren rascal. I saw him put down the other day with an ordinary fool. There's no more brains than a stone." In modern day English, barren means unable to have babies. And what Malvolio is getting at is that Feste no longer has any wit or amusing jokes within him. He is figuratively empty. He goes on to compare Feste to a jester employed by a pub, unquestionably socially inferior, and says that a few days previously, the pub jester was able to crack jokes at his expense, with Feste unable to respond. These are unkind, unsympathetic words. After all, fools depended on their wit, their quick use of language for their living. And Olivia rightly points out that Malvolio is being too harsh. She cries that to be generous, guiltless and of free disposition is to take those things for bird bolts that you deem cannon bullets. Shakespeare's imagery indicates that Malvolio reacts disproportionately to Feste's gags, gets offended far too easily. Kind, decent, open-minded people brush off bird bolts, harmless, flat-headed arrows, and do not make them more significant than they really are. Do not interpret them, as Malvolio does, as dangerous, potentially life-ending cannon bullets. What this means, of course, is that by being so judgmental, Malvolio isolates himself. How can a mutually fulfilling friendship or relationship arise when one person calls another in public a barren rascal? And it isn't only Feste who Malvolio isolates himself from. In Act 2, Scene 3, the Countess Olivia's uncle, Sir Toby Belch, is up late at night, drinking and singing riotously, with Feste and Sir Andrew Aguecheek. First Maria, Olivia's waiting gentlewoman, then Malvolio, enter to urge the revellers to quiet down. Unsurprising, as it is annoying hearing a drunken racket going on downstairs when you're trying to sleep. Maria comes in and cries, "What a caterwauling do you keep here? If my lady have not called up her steward Malvolio and bid him turn you out of doors, never trust me." The noun caterwauling sounds very similar to cat wailing, and certainly Maria is being uncomplimentary about the terrible noise of the three men raucously roaring tunes late into the night. However, compare her response to Malvolio's opening words as he marches in moments later. "My masters, are you mad or what have you? Have you no wit, manners, nor honesty, but to gabble like tinkers at this time of night? Do you make an alehouse of my lady's house, that you squeak out your cosiest catches without any mitigation or remorse of voice?" Malvolio's initial three increasingly elaborate rhetorical questions go much further than Maria's verdict on the men singing and practical warning about the consequences. He suggests that the drinkers are turning a countess's respectable home into a pub and alehouse. He goes much further than Maria's single word caterwauling by describing the men's voices as squeaking or sounding ridiculously high-pitched, unmanly, like mice, and the songs in the memorable alliterative phrase as cosy as catches. Catches are songs sung as a round, whilst cosiers are cobblers, shoe menders. In the previous rhetorical question, Malvolio knows he is right in what he says, so doesn't expect an answer. He compares the men to tinkers or gypsies. As a mere steward, Malvolio is going too far. Sir Toby Belch is a close relative of his mistress, and himself part of the aristocracy. Although it may be reasonable for Malvolio to, like Maria, ask for the noise to be kept down, it is not appropriate for him to address the men using such haughty, dismissive language. And so Malvolio isolates himself from other members of the household, with disastrous personal consequences for himself later on in the play, as I will discuss later on. Crooks, the stable buck in Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, does not have the luxury of choosing to isolate himself from other members of the community, as Malvolio effectively does. It happens automatically due to his race. In 1930s America, black people were treated effectively as second-class citizens, and it was only in the 1960s that something approaching equal rights came into force with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This piece of legislation outlawed discrimination against racial, ethnic, national and religious minorities, and also ensured equality in schools and in voting practices. Sir Steinbeck, writing decades earlier, represents American society realistically when he shows the dismissive attitude other characters have towards Crooks, summed up in the now deeply offensive use of the word nigger. In Part 4, Steinbeck describes what happens when Lenny tries to enter Crooks' sleeping quarters, separate from the other workers on the ranch due to his race. He writes, Crooks said sharply, "You got no right to come into my room. This here's my room. Nobody got the right in here but me." The adverb sharply describes Crooks' tone of voice, and his words show him trying to defend the only right he has, to be alone in his own small little patch. However, as the conversation goes on and Crooks drops some of his defences, it becomes clear that the black man detests his isolation from the others in the ranch. He poses a series of potential scenarios towards the uncomprehending Lenny, and although Lenny may not understand fully, the reader most certainly does. Suppose you didn't have nobody. Suppose you couldn't go into the bunkhouse and play rummy because you were black. How'd you like that? A guy goes nuts if he ain't got nobody. I tell you, a guy gets too lonely and he gets sick. So is a black man. Crooks is unable to take part in something as harmless, ordinary and everyday as a game of cards due to his race. And as his speech gets more and more worked up, he confesses the consequences of this isolation, a terrible strain on his mental health, as indicated in the phrase, goes nuts and gets sick. Yet there is nothing Crooks can do about it. society has determined that he must remain an outsider because of racial prejudice and has no interest whatsoever on how that may or may not affect him. Crooks hates, loathes, detests his isolation. Malvolio in Twelfth Night seems to quite enjoy it, at least in the earlier parts of the play. Towards the beginning of Act 2, Scene 5, the audience in the hidden Sir Toby, Sir Andrew and Fabian, another member of the Countess Olivia's household, watch Malvolio happily, dreamily talking and speculating to himself. Even without any plotting from others, he contentedly wonders about the future possibility of being married to Olivia. On his own, his imagination provides him with a rich source of pleasure. He pictures himself calling my officers about me in my branched velvet gown, having come from a daybed where I have left Olivia sleeping. From the point of view of the onlookers, especially Olivia's uncle, this is a preposterous fantasy, but left to its own devices is surely a fairly harmless one. How many of us have not fantasised about something we know deep inside will never happen? Malvolio's adjectives, branched and velvet, show him thoroughly enjoying his own vision, which he embroiders with small details to help him picture it with more precision. The image of him leaving Olivia sleeping in a daybed or a couch emphasises once again that even in his imagination, Malvolio tends to prefer to be predominantly alone, to have himself very much as the centre of the picture. However, whereas Crooks in Of Mice and Men is led to question his sanity due to his terrible loneliness, in Twelfth Night, Malvolio's decision, unconscious or not, to isolate himself from potential allies and friends in Olivia's household results in a malicious plot, which ultimately results in his sanity being cruelly toyed with. In the scene just mentioned, Malvolio finds a letter, which he thinks has been written by Olivia, but is actually forged by Maria. This letter cryptically declares undying love for him and makes a series of ludicrous suggestions as to how he can please her. By smiling irritatingly and completely out of character the whole time, wearing bright yellow stockings cross-gartered, being rude and surly to other members of the household. And so when Olivia first sees this strange behaviour, she is astonished and is quickly convinced by others that Malvolio has lost his marbles. This encounter takes place in Act 3, Scene 4. Maria has already helped prepare Olivia's reaction with the lines, "He is sure possessed, madam." In Shakespeare's time, society had a far less enlightened understanding of mental illness, and people behaving erratically, peculiarly, utterly, would often be dismissed as being mad or possessed by the devil, and certainly Olivia is quickly astonished by the change in her steward. After hearing him make seemingly inexplicable comments about wanting to please the eye of one, and referring to some writing which she knows nothing about, Olivia's impression of Malvolio as needing, at the very least, rest is confirmed when she asks, "Wilt thou go to bed, Malvolio?" Malvolio interprets this benevolent question from a kind employer as something far more suggestive. He cries enthusiastically, "To bed? Aye, sweetheart, and I'll come to thee." Malvolio clearly thinks that Olivia is keen to consummate their as yet not started relationship and offers to reciprocate, yet the extraordinary change in his language only serves to convince his mistress of his madness. Malvolio, as Olivia herself described him, is normally sad and civil, restrained and extremely polite. Yet now he has transformed himself into making sexually suggestive remarks and referring to his mistress in the ludicrously familiar, wholly inappropriate, lover-esque term sweetheart. Olivia rather naively asks for him to be trusted into the care of Sir Toby Belch, whom earlier Malvolio has insulted with his presumptuous, overbearing demands for dignity, quiet and less alcohol. Sir Toby successfully has Malvolio put into a dark room and bound, where he has to suffer the double indignity of having his mental capabilities questioned and beg to be released. Shakespeare shows that the consequences of excessive pride and presumption and not bothering to make friends or allies can be abject humiliation.